Have you ever heard someone, perhaps standing across the room from you or passing nearby in the street, shout out, "Hey, you!" And you turn to see who the voice is seeking, but you don't think it could be you. But as you check to either side and glance around behind you, there's no one else who appears to be the object of the calling. Yet you still think, they're surely not talking to me. Well, in the part of the New Testament letter of James that we come to study this morning, that's the first few verses of chapter 5, it's interesting how each of two early sections begin with what might be described as a call out, a hey you. In verse 1, James leads off with an attention-getting, "Look here," and then shortly follows it in verse 2 with almost a plaintive shout, "Listen." But do you ever read parts of the Bible and think to yourself, well, that's interesting, but it really doesn't have anything to say to me? God's given a shout out, but to somebody else, surely. And so you read on, or you just don't pay a whole lot of attention to what's being said because this part just doesn't seem directed to you. There's a risk this morning as we listen to the chosen words from James that some may quickly say, I think this surely is aimed at someone else's direction. Thanks for the sermon. I realize it's a part of this letter, but he just doesn't seem to be speaking to me. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you might come to that conclusion about the words that we study together. And one might be the strong statement that's directed very fiercely towards rich people. And when we think about rich people, we often don't think about ourselves as being rich. Most of us, when we think about truly rich people, think of names like Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, or Bill Gates, the creator of Microsoft, or Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway fame, or Mark Zuckerberg, the young originator and the head of Facebook. Now these people are rich. Each of these men made it to the very top of the 2020 global rich list. Bezos, who's number one, has an estimated worth of $140 billion. Now, that's down $7 billion from last year, mainly due to one of the world's most costly divorce settlements in the past year. Gates comes in at number 3 with $105 billion. Buffett has his place at number 4 with $102 billion, and Zuckerberg follows at number 5 with $84 billion. The top 10 on that global rich list collectively added about $140 billion to their fortune last year, at least before the current COVID-19 crisis, although Amazon seems to be doing pretty good at the moment. And these top 10 now share a combined worth of $961 billion, knocking right on the door of $1 trillion. Now, most people would agree that's rich. But we're not rich, at least not like that, or in a lot of other ways that people think about being rich, at least so we think. Now James has some encouraging things to say about the poor of the day, too, but most of us wouldn't put ourselves in that social category either. Our bank and saving accounts wouldn't draw the interest of any high-end financial advisor, perhaps, but we're not that poor. Most of us would probably describe ourselves as middle class rather than poor, or at least not any kind of desperate poor sort of way. Most of us have a house, or at least the means to rent some place in which to live. We have a car. Some of us have 2, and a job, or at least we did before all this coronavirus thing. We probably are all going to have some lunch and dinner today, and you likely started off your morning with some kind of breakfast, if it was only just a banana or a cup of coffee. There are some clothes in our closets. We typically pay most of our bills, and we make sure that the contribution into Social Security goes out through our paycheck. So there's that, hopefully, to look forward to someday, too. So it would be a stretch to call ourselves poor. Then, neither are we rich. Well, in Jesus' day, there were actually 2 primary classes of people who were either rich. You were either rich or you were poor. And those 2, there was very little in between. And that's the way it was throughout much of the ancient world. The middle class that we've come to think of ourselves fitting in is a much more recent phenomenon. But in But in James' time, there were basically just these two classes of people, the haves, those having quite a lot, and the have-nots, who quite literally had very, very little. There was also no social welfare system in place back during the time of James. So for those among the have-nots, you quite literally had not, because the haves held all the cards and there was nothing left for you. Well, since you might not think of yourself as among the super rich or among the super poor, you could still be thinking, James really doesn't have anything to say personally to me. Well, that isn't necessarily the case. If you hang on there just a while, I think you'll find that he has some very uncomfortably close to the heart things to say to all of us. That his shout out across the room is really worth listening to and hearing, even if you're still not sure you could be counted among either the rich or the poor. A lot of our current perspective on wealth has to do with the fact that you and I have a much more economically secure place to live within the Western world, or at least we did before COVID-19 and the tanking of the stock market and oil selling for a -$1 per barrel. I didn't even know something like that was possible before this week. But I think we all believe that eventually, when all of this is said and done, that we'll get back, at least in our part of the world, to a healthier place. But rich is a relative term, and rich or poor can be seen in very different ways. When it's comparing us to the rest of the world, or even reflecting where we are just in the United States, you might be interested in this fact that 1% of the world's population currently holds over 44% of all household wealth. And the truth is that Americans, that's you and me, don't really have to be extremely wealthy to claim a spot within this elite 1% of the world group that I just mentioned. In fact, if you make at least $32,400 in annual income, which includes most school teachers, nurses, other moderately salaried individuals, you fall within this top global 1% category of high wage earners, and you collectively possess 44% of all the household wealth in the world. That's amazing. Wealth is relative, isn't it? You know, I found out when I was doing some research this week that there are even some websites that allow you to punch in whatever your salary that you made and see how it stacks up against the rest of the world financially. Well, one that I tried called the Rich Calculator looked pretty legitimate. And I took my last year's salary. That's when I was working full-time before the university closed. I thought that was a better figure to use. And it calculated my earnings as compared to both those within the U.S. as well as throughout all the world. And what it told me forced me to be thankful. Now, quite honestly, I didn't make a sum that I think would lead anyone to classify me as rich. But the calculator placed me in the top 13.73% category of richest Americans. Or stating it another way, it said that I earned 184.21% more than the average income in the U.S. It got even more startling when my riches were compared to those in the whole world. My income put me among the top 0.42% category of the richest people in the world, and said that I earned 4,242.42% more than the global income average wage. I know there are a lot of variables to consider: cost of living, social settings, access to resources, cultural differences, exchange values, education, and the list could go on and on. But if I'm being truly honest, I am rich, at least in comparison to many people. And the sad fact is that the main reason I don't know this to be true is because I spend most of my time primarily with those like you who are as rich as I am. If I only compare myself with you and others in my typical social circle, we may not be seemingly so far apart on a financial plane, but when I compare myself to everybody else in the U.S. and especially everybody else in the world, things get much different. There are enormous disparities in life when it comes to wealth across the globe. And I'm surprisingly rich. I remember back in the 1990s, when I made mission trips to work in the newly opened area of Ukraine. It was after the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, and there were whole families there with whom we worked that were living on less than $30 for a whole month. That was top drawer for them. And I found myself asking, how'd they do it? My adopted daughter was born in a poor rural village in central Mexico, where I watched little children play barefooted in the streets, living on so little. When I served at Parkside, a church on the east side of Cincinnati, we sent waves of short-term workers to the island of Haiti, one of the most desperate, poverty-stricken countries in all the world. With all that needs to be considered, I think it's safe to say that most of us here today are actually quite rich, at least in comparison to the 99% of the whole rest of the world. So maybe the voice of James should capture a little more of our attention. He may be actually shouting out to us, at least a little bit, when he says, hey, you, look, listen. James 5, first few verses in the New Living Translation, from which I'm going to be reading, have this heading, kind of a way to look and see what the verses are going to be that are following. It says, warning to the rich. Well, I confess, as I studied through the passage over the course of the past week, it increasingly got my attention, and it made me more and more uncomfortable, even prompted me to rethink some things about my own perspective on real riches. I hope it can do the same thing for you. James begins in chapter 5 with these attention-getting words. Look here, you rich people. Weep and groan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead of you. Your wealth is rotting away, and your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. This corroded treasure you have hoarded will testify against you on the day of judgment. For listen, hear the cries of the field workers whom you have cheated of their pay. The cries of those who harvest your fields have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. You have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. You have fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. You have condemned innocent people who do not resist you. All right, I set you up. I admit it. I knew that if you first heard what James had to say in such an ominous way, you'd for sure be saying, well, this isn't something that's personally communicating anything to me. While we may be rich by these whole world standards, we're hopefully not living in so extreme a fashion as James paints and condemns here in these verses. You might even wonder whether these rich people to whom James is shouting out these words are even a part of the church, or whether they could even be believers, since they were acting in such what seems to be so crazy a way in this harsh indictment that James offers for them. Honestly, there are some who argue the case either way, that James was writing about extremely pagan rich people, or that there were some within the church who needed to hear at least some measure of the warning. Oh, there was encouragement, too, that came through these words that would help those that were the suffering poor, who were likely the greater majority of the church, so they could know that economic injustice wasn't being ignored by God. But even with the extremes of James' words, I think there's still application for us. There's something about wealth and possessions that too easily deceives us. Hang on to that word, deceives. It does it to us whether we're rich or poor. We tend to put our confidence in our stuff and our treasures. We measure our lives by the sizes of our houses, our salaries, our bank accounts, our stock dividends, our retirement savings, how full our closets may be, even whether they're walk-ins or not, or how large or on what high a floor we enjoy our office space. And if we don't rank on the global rich list, too many of us would still love to climb toward the top 10 with at least our own social group. Stuff matters to us, often too much. There's a strange sense of not just satisfaction, but also confidence, even security that stuff gives us, which is why this current coronavirus crisis is probably beginning to wear us down, even beyond the fact that we're growing a little stir crazy working and sheltering in place. It's not just that we might get sick or even die. I'm not sure that a lot of us have that as our deepest concern, since the odds are with us, but that we might lose our stuff, or at least the means that we have to secure those things for ourselves. Being able to keep paying our bills, enjoying the benefits of life, having a job, putting gas in our cars, taking that long dreamed for vacation, keeping ourselves happy. James has said, somebody has said, money can't buy happiness, but it sure makes misery easier to live with. This whole crisis that we're in might be easier to bear if we just had enough stuff so as not to worry about what we might lose. In James' day, wealth was defined by things like how plentiful are your crops, or the size of your wardrobe, or how many bars of silver and gold you have hidden away in some place in your house. It was about tangible treasures. For the poor in that day, they often only owned one set of clothes, and that was what they had on their back. So I guess the requirement was you washed and dried overnight. It's interesting, Jesus once said about himself that foxes have dens to live in and birds have nests, but the Son of Man, that's how he referred to himself, has no place even to lay his head. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray for their daily bread, it probably meant just that, their daily bread. They didn't know what they were going to have for tomorrow. And when Jesus sent out his 12 on a kind of a early trial missionary adventure, he told them this. He said, don't take any money in your money belts. No gold or silver or even copper coins. Don't carry a traveler's bag with change of clothes or sandals or even a walking stick. Now that's what I'd call packing lightly. Don't place your confidence for this mission in stuff. Trust God, Jesus was saying, and those that'll help you along the way. And I think it was meant to teach them something very important about faith and trust that we would do well to learn. It's not that beds and houses or food or any other sort of thing are bad, but they can become false sources of our security. They can deceive us. In his Sermon on the Mount, which, by the way, is echoed in several words and ways in the text of James, Jesus included this admonition. Matthew 6, verse 19. Don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them and where thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. That's why I told you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food or drink or enough clothes to wear. Isn't life more than food and your body more than clothing? Don't worry about these things. These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers, but your Heavenly Father already knows your needs. Seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and He will give you everything you need. There's something in the economy of the kingdom that doesn't square with the economy of the world. The values of each are dramatically different, even opposed to one another. Now, does this mean that it's wrong or even sinful to be rich? I don't think either James or Jesus are arguing that somehow poverty is holy or divine and that having wealth is always evil. There were righteous people of means throughout all of biblical history. Abraham, Solomon, the wealthy women patrons that we met that seem to have supplied financial resources for Jesus' ministry. There was Joseph of Arimathea, the man who gave Jesus his tomb, or the merchant lady Lydia, who helped establish the church in Philippi. And I could go on and list many more who've lived and shared their wealth generously for kingdom purposes while still here on earth. But Jesus and James both do seem to be saying that our view of wealth and possessions gives away something important about where our heart's affections lie. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. And both James and Jesus warn that if we attach our hearts to things, however grand they may be, it will ultimately lead to deep disappointment. Crops, even from abundant harvest, will someday rot away. Clothes, even among some of the finest ever made, will ultimately have moths turn them into rags, and the finest gold and silver will eventually become corroded too. There's far more to life than stuff. The earthly treasures we overconfidently embrace instead of eternal treasures that we should be storing up for ourselves in heaven. It's all just a matter of where our affections lie. Somebody once said that they had never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul into a cemetery. Now, this is an artistic attempt imagining what it might look like, but it's only to cause us to smile at the ridiculousness of the whole statement. You really can't take it with you. Or to see it another way, one thing that a rich man and a poor man do have in common is something 6 feet deep. There's a painful picture provided in verses 2 and 3 of our text where after all the treasure stuff is in life rots or gets eaten up or becomes tarnished, it goes on to say, the very wealth you were counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. That's a pleasant thought. We lose not just our stuff, but then we lose our lives. There was a trash pit outside the walls of ancient Jerusalem in a valley called Gehenna or Hinnom, where all that was cast away was left to be burned. And the smoke from that seemingly always burning eternal fire was more than once used by Jesus as rich imagery for the hell that is to come. It's a fitting and frightening way to describe what happens when what we treasure really gets all burned up like trash in the end. Paul, when he was describing the values transformation that occurred in his own life after meeting Jesus, put it this way in Philippians 3, 8 and 10. Everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant. Dog dung. I've dumped it all in the trash so that I could embrace Christ and be embraced by him. I gave up all that inferior stuff so I could know Christ personally. Paul was talking about his righteous attempts to somehow earn his way to heaven, but I think the change of heart that he describes, his values, seems to be similar than what James is urging on. Put it on the trash pile, those things that are inferior stuff, rather than find our body consumed by hell's purging fire. Riches are deceiving, and those who wait until the end will make the discovery that will be painfully disappointing. So why do riches still compel us even in the face of this kind of warning? Because riches don't just deceive us, but here's another word, they please us, or at least they promise to please. There is an old phrase, he who dies with the most toys wins. You ever heard that one? John Piper in his book, Don't Waste Your Life, writes, I am wired by nature to love the same toys the world does. I start to fit in. I start to love what others love. I start to call earth home. And before you know it, I'm calling luxuries needs. And I'm using my money just the way unbelievers do. I sink into a secular mindset. Or to put it another way, we grow to like or to love the things that riches can buy for us. In verse 8, James writes, you have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying your every desire. Sin wouldn't be so dangerous if it weren't pleasurable. Stuff gives us joy, at least in a temporary fashion. Paul once wrote to young Timothy, 1 Timothy 6 and following, true godliness with contentment is itself great wealth. After all, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can't take anything with us when we leave. So, if we have enough food and clothing, let us be content. But people who long to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Teach those, he tells Timothy, teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasures as a good foundation for the future so many of them can experience true life. Our problem in this life is that our desires always exceed our contentment. We never seem to be satisfied, and so this pile of stuff that we have always gets bigger and bigger. Have you ever heard somebody say that that advertisement encourages us to buy one less thing in life, or to lose something unless it's a few pounds, or deny yourself of anything? Back in the 1950s, late 50s, a guy named Vance Packard wrote what became a classic book about the growing power of advertising, in which he argued that part of the task of an advertiser is to sow a sense of discontentment in our hearts with what we already possess in order to get us to buy something more that we don't have. For instance, you have a car, but you need a better model, which will please you more. The detergent that you use really doesn't get the job done as well as the new improved one that you can buy. Riches entice us relentlessly. We always want something newer, cooler, better. My son works for Apple in New York City, so we're always talking about the products. And of course, right now, the new thing for them is the better and even cheaper iPhone SE. Have you seen it? Do you want it? It's almost like our satisfaction gets desensitized. What pleased us once needs to be replaced by something that pleases us more. Fidelity Investments did a survey some years back of a group that they served that included individuals that had at least $1 million in investment assets. Now, this excluded the real estate or retirement savings they had. It didn't include house, property, those kind of things. It was just $1 million that they could play with as far as investment. And of those that Fidelity surveyed who had this sort of money, 42% of them reported that they did not feel wealthy. There's something both satisfying and insatiable about wealth. It pleases us, but it always makes us yearn for something more. Someone was once asked, "What's enough?" To which came the reply, "Just one thing more." Which leads me to the last thing that I need to point out to you that James emphatically has to say. Riches don't just deceive us, they continually please us, but what it leads to is our oppressing other people, at least a lot of the time. It's here where James takes on a judging voice, much like a prophet. He even echoes some of the harsh condemnations that appear against some of the rich elites in the Old Testament. Those in James' times who felt like that they couldn't get enough for themselves, that they would just consciously in some way take away from other people. You remember at the outset that we talked about the haves and the have-nots? Well, here is where the two come together, but not for anything good. In James' day, those who were rich required common laborers to do the work. If they had vast farms, they needed people to plant and harvest their crops. If they wanted bigger houses, somebody needed to build them for them. And virtually all the laborers back in that day were like those that you might find looking for work at a manpower place that hires out a person for the day. These workers were quite literally day laborers. They had little to nothing, so the only way they survived was by putting in a long day of work, getting paid the day's wage, and then going home to provide for the needs of the family. And the next day they would get up and they would do the same thing again, and then again, and then again. Daily work to buy daily bread to survive for yet another day. James describes that pattern here in our verse, but with a tragic twist. At the end of a long day of work, the laborers come in from the harvest field expecting, needing to be paid, but they are met by their owner or owners or foreman with some kind of lame excuse for why the pay isn't available just then. But if they'll just come back tomorrow, since there's still so much more harvesting work to do, they would pay them for 2 days. But the evening of the next day comes and they, tired and worn out, come back expecting to get paid, but once more they get some very lame excuse about why the money's still not available. But they still return for yet another day, and what else are they supposed to do? They're poor. They've invested 2 days of work. They've been promised more, so they work a third day and perhaps a fourth or a fifth, but still with no promise of pay, at least not all of what's due to them. You see, the problem is not that the landowner wasn't able to pay them at all. The issue seemed to be that he just chose not to pay them. He doesn't want to take the money out of the bank. He doesn't want to stop losing the interest, or for some other kind of selfish reason. But it really just boils down to the fact that he has so much that he really does not care about these poor men who have put in a full week of hard labor without the essential money that they need to buy their food for their poor families to be able to eat and survive. This rich man, it appears, probably had just cheated these workers out of their pay. These rich men had everything, while their workers had absolutely nothing, hanging on quite unjustly just to hopefully get one thing more. And what are these workers supposed to do? They don't really have any resources to sue in court, and if they were to try, these rich employers would only hire better lawyers or bribe receptive judges to get their way, and the laborers wouldn't only lose their case, but they also would probably lose any hope of getting any of the back pay. Have you ever heard about what someone has called the other golden rule? It goes like this: whoever has the gold makes the rules, or at least abuses the rules in this case. If only there were not just something that happened in James' time like this, but it has been the bane of the poor for years before, and even down to our time, so much so that it became one of the dominant themes of the Old Testament. Prophets' sermons were directed at such rich abusers of the poor. And they could call up the Old Testament law that very specifically told the rich managers what they were supposed to do. For instance, in Leviticus 19, verse 13, it says, "Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not make your hired workers wait until the next day to receive their pay." Or in Deuteronomy 24, 14 and 15, "Never take advantage of poor and destitute laborers, whether they are fellow Israelites or foreigners, aliens, living in your towns. You must pay them their wages each day before the sunset, because they're poor and they're counting on it. If you don't, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as a sin." And the prophet Malachi provides these harsh words from God in his prophecy that seem to echo the prophetic words of James. "I will put you on trial," God says. "I will speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress widows or orphans, or who deprive the foreigners living among you of justice. For these people do not fear me, says the Lord, the Lord of heaven's armies." It's sad enough that the poor suffer, but that they also suffer even more deeply at the hands of those who have so much, the rich. It's the greater crime. James says these poor men may not have had a loud enough voice to protest the treatment of these wealthy owners or to sue them in the local courts, but their cries have reached the ears of the Lord of heaven's armies. And God is coming to their defense. And when God, with all the forces of heaven's armies, shows up in this divine courtroom, there will be no doubt about the outcome. James says, "You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. James and God say, you have condemned and killed innocent people who do not or could not resist you, and now will come your judgment day. It's here that I need to get a little more personal. I read an article in the New York Times earlier this week that carried this headline. Instead of coronavirus, the hunger will kill us. A global food crisis looms. The article began with these words: the world has never faced a hunger emergency like this, experts say. It could double the number of people facing acute hunger to 265 million by the end of this year. It later quotes a day worker from New Delhi, India, who's been waiting to eat his first meal in a day at a feeding center. And he says, instead of coronavirus, the hunger will kill us. He said he was ashamed to beg for food, but he had no other option. The lockdown, he says, has trampled our dignity. From the slums of Nairobi, Kenya, to conflict-ridden countries like Ethiopia, where supply trails are shut down by national lockdowns, and manpower that's needed to transport all the food and medicine is being forced to shelter in place, people are dying. The chief economist at the World Food Program in the United Nations says, we've never seen anything like this before. It wasn't a pretty picture to begin with, but this makes it truly unprecedented and uncharted territory. I watched a video Facebook post this past Friday from Ajay Lal, who's from our Fellowship of Churches and leads the Central India Christian Mission. He said they were desperately trying to help those in India who have been so impacted by COVID-19. He said that 1/3 of the Indian population are what they call laborers, like these workers that are mentioned in James. They're day laborers. Ajay says they make less than $2 for 8 to 10 hours of work every day. If only they could find some ability to be able to get to work, but everything's shut down. I'm rich. They're poor. The Gallup Association a few years ago reported that the average poverty line for the world's poorest 10 to 20 countries is $1.25 per day. In developing countries, it's only a little bit more, $2 per day. Cost of a cup of coffee for a lot of us. I don't need a rich calculator to convince me that I am rich and that they are poor. It's said that early Christians went so far as to say that if a Christian has more than they need, while the neighbor is in need, the Christian is a thief. If we have 2 coats, we have stolen one. Or as John the Baptist cried out in the wilderness to those that were listening to him, prove by the way you live that you have repented of your sins and turned toward God. And the crowds asked, what should we do? And John replied, if you have 2 shirts, give one to the poor. If you have food, share it with those who are hungry. We had a problem with a washing machine at our house that began back in early February, and it's too long a story to tell. It's a long, drawn-out warranty settlement that required us to wait and wait and wait until just about a week ago, when finally we got a new working washing machine. A good next-door neighbor let us wash in her basement, but my wife was thrilled when finally we got our new machine and we could do the wash all on our own. But this week she told me that she had counted the number of my shirts that she had washed and hung up in my closet after one big wash. And my first response to her was, no way, I can't have that many shirts. Later I snuck up while she wasn't looking, and I counted them too, and I'm embarrassed to admit, once more, I'm rich. And quite frankly, I have to ask myself how much I honestly care about the stark income inequality that exists not just all over the world, but even within our own local communities. James' words have haunted me this week. I've taken a dive in statistics and news stories about poverty and riches all over the world as I've tried to work through the meaning of these words from James' letters. And I've been forced to ask that question again and again. How rich am I? And I'm trying to get you to ask the same question. It's the hard voice of James that's resonated through this message. And through my head today that hopefully would cause us to say, could it be that he actually is talking to me too? If there are people in this world who will die of hunger and I still have plenty of food in my house, is that living justly? If someone is naked and I have a closet full of clothes, some of which I never even wear, is that living justly? Perhaps James is trying to get our attention today, much as he was when he wrote these words centuries before. Look here, you rich people. Listen, hear the cries of those who by intention or unintentional neglect have not gotten paid, who don't have the basic means of life. I really am rich, and they are poor. So what are we going to do about it? Now, the text of James ends in an interesting way. It's kind of open-ended. It doesn't have a resolution other than the certainty of judgment, the rotting crops, the moth-eaten clothes, the corroded silver and gold, and the desperate cries of all those who are not having their needs met by the rich. So I wonder, how do I write the end of the story? I'm rich. So what am I going to do about it? Have you wrestled at least a little bit with that question too? Or do we just wait selfishly into the day of judgment? I don't think either of us would purposely choose that way to end our story. If we know that we're rich, and we really are in relative terms, James has called us out on it. I guess the question is, are we going to do anything about it?